Everybody in the NBA wants Cooper Flagg right now, but things are getting a little out of control. Now, I'm a Nets fan, so you better believe that when lottery night rolls around, I'm going to be anxiously watching to see if the Nets can get a franchise-altering player like Cooper Flagg with the first overall pick. But things have officially gone too far. Some teams around the league are taking measures that we've never seen before to try and lose games and are actively being investigated for trying to tank and throw away games, all in an effort just to get the best lottery odds possible. Now, this isn't new. Teams have been tanking, trying to throw away games, trying to get the best odds possible, the first overall pick for literally decades in the NBA. This is something that has been integral to multiple franchises' team building strategies over the years. But what the Toronto Raptors just did is completely different. Now, for a little bit of context, the Raptors, my Nets, and the Philadelphia 76ers are all jockeying for the 5th worst record in the entire NBA. The top 4 teams in terms of lottery odds are pretty set in stone in some order, but that 5th spot is up for grabs, and almost certainly that team is going to either be Philadelphia, Toronto, or Brooklyn. So all 3 of these teams are trying to lose as many games as possible. The problem for Toronto is relative to Philadelphia and Brooklyn, they've been winning too many games lately. They're 6-4 in their last 10 games as of the recording of this video, so they took some pretty drastic measures to make sure that they were going to lose. The Raptors were playing the Trailblazers in a game that they desperately wanted to lose, and for most of the game, things looked pretty normal for Toronto. They were sitting some guys. Brandon Ingram still has not played because he has apparently the worst sprained ankle of all time. They have some other guys that haven't really been playing, but Scottie Barnes and Jakob Poeltl were playing in a game. They were healthy and playing pretty close to their normal rotations as we got towards the end of a very close fourth quarter. But despite those guys being healthy, playing their normal rotations, being 2 starters, 2 of the best players on the team, they did not play for most of the fourth quarter, and as a result, Toronto lost the game. Scottie Barnes subbed out with a little less than 9 minutes to go in the fourth quarter of a close game and did not come back, and the same thing for Jakob Poeltl with about 5.5 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Now, traditionally, the way that teams would tank is they would just not play their guys. Scottie Barnes, Jakob Poeltl would not have played in this game. It would have given them the best chance to possibly lose, but the league has cracked down on that over the years. There's multiple teams around the league right now that are actively being investigated, including Philadelphia, for sitting their players and not having them play to try and get the best lottery odds possible. But what Toronto did is a little bit different, because presumably if you're at the game, you're thinking Toronto's trying to win the game. They've got their starters out there for most of the game. Yes, there's a couple of guys that aren't playing that maybe normally would have if it was a must-win game, but once you're in the game and you're playing, the goal is to try and win. It's not like you're going to intentionally miss shots. It's not like you're going to intentionally turn the ball over, but that's kind of what the Raptors did. They decided in the middle of the game towards the fourth quarter to say, okay, this is a little bit too close for comfort. We've been winning too many games, and they actively chose in the middle of the game to try and lose. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, how is this any different than a team just not playing their players, just making up some injury, having them sit for the rest of the season in an effort to lose games? At least they're actually having their guys play because they have to under these new rules they put in over the last couple of years. Well, this is different because you might as well just have Scottie Barnes turn the ball over on purpose. You might as well tell your guys that are out there to not make threes. The entire assumption of an NBA game, a professional game, is that everybody out there is trying to win. They're trying to score. They're trying to win the game, and the Raptors are not trying to do that. That's the only explanation for why Scottie Barnes and Jakob Poeltl would not have finished this game. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that I'm mad about this as a Nets fan, because if it's legal, if it's allowed, then the Nets should be doing the same thing. They should be doing everything they can to try and get that 5th best lottery odds. You can see the difference and the dramatic difference in the percentages in terms of a top 4 pick and, of course, the number 1 overall pick in this draft. Cooper Flagg has fully established himself as the number 1 prospect in this class, one of the better prospects we've seen over the last couple of seasons. There was some thought in the middle of the year that maybe Ace Bailey, Dylan Harper, a couple of other guys would push him for that top spot, but it's Cooper Flagg. And if you get him, if you're the Nets and you end up with Cooper Flagg because you lost a ton of games towards the end of the year and it increased your odds, it far outweighs any kind of negative downside that you could have had for potentially losing games. I totally understand why teams are doing that. And if I'm the Nets, if I'm any of these other teams, it makes sense to try and lose as many games as possible. But when you're in the middle of the game and then decide that you're just not going to be competitive anymore, that's a concern for certainly the league, and a league that has been trying to deal with this tanking issue for decades. Because like I said, traditionally teams would just not play their starters, and that's why some of these teams are being investigated. Either teams like Philadelphia that are trying to tank, that are trying to lose games, shutting down Joel Embiid was a legit injury. Paul George has had a bunch of different issues going on, but they've sat other guys as well. They're being investigated for that. I wouldn't be surprised if Toronto gets investigated for this. And then even on the other side of it, OKC has been sitting a bunch of guys because they have such a big lead in the Western Conference. They're going to be the 1 seed. They have a chance to be the 1 seed in the entire league and have home court advantage if they were to get all the way to the finals. And they're being investigated for sitting guys guys trying to rest and be healthy. This has been an issue. Sitting players, player participation has been a problem for the league for years. And so this isn't new, but it is something that the league has tried to deal with over time. And I wouldn't be surprised if they look into what Toronto did as well. You can go back through the last couple of years in the NBA. They've changed the lottery odds around to where you're not as incentivized to be the worst record in the league or the third worst record in the league. All the odds have been split up a little bit more evenly, which ironically has actually ended up in some teams tanking more so that they could try and get to like the 10th worst record, because then their odds of getting a really high pick are even better than they would have been the couple years prior. They added in this player participation policy that we've been talking about teams being investigated for, where basically if you have a national TV game and you've got a couple of all-stars, like at least one of those guys has to play. You can't sit multiple guys. And again, they're just really keeping an eye on this. But the problem with tanking, and the problem that has always been an issue for the league in terms of trying to regulate this, is it is literally impossible to regulate. Right now, the structure is teams are getting fined. Teams are getting fined like $100,000, which for an NBA team is like a rounding error, but that is still how you'd quote unquote get in trouble for tanking, for violating the player participation policy by sitting players that are actually healthy so you can try and lose games, try and get better lottery odds. But if you ask any NBA team out there if they'd rather play their guys, potentially win a game that worsens their lottery odds and their chances of getting Cooper Flag, or they'd rather sit some guys and pay $100,000 fine, they're going to pay the $100,000 fine 100 times out of 100. If you just went to the teams and said, hey, can you donate $100,000 so you get better lottery odds? They're going to do that every single time. And under the current rules, the way that the league is currently set up, they do not have a punishment that is severe enough to truly deter teams from tanking. And that's for a very simple reason. It is so incredibly valuable at the NBA level to add a player like Cooper Flag, or a couple of years ago, add someone like Victor Wembanyama. It is the most impactful thing you can have as an NBA team, is you get the first overall pick and you get one of these quote unquote generational prospects. It is so beneficial to team building and overall talent acquisition. You get one player and things completely change for you overnight. You think about the San Antonio Spurs and where they are now, having added Victor Wembanyama, and where they would have been had they got the 5th pick in that draft because their lottery odds were worse, because they didn't win as many games. And the incentive for teams to lose and teams to tank is so great that there's almost no penalty that the league could put into place realistically to prevent teams from tanking, even to the extent that Toronto did against Portland. Short of literally taking away their first round pick or changing the odds after the fact, if it's been found that you violated the player participation policy to such an extent that the league felt like they needed to step in, maybe they could change around the lottery odds and say, no, this win or this loss or whatever the case may be, it doesn't count because you tried to lose on purpose because you sat Scotty Barnes and Jakob Poeltl at the end of this game. But that's not going to happen. That's way too dramatic of a punishment. But that's the only kind of thing that would really cause these teams to be incentivized to not tank, essentially. And what happened with Toronto is particularly interesting because it's not just that guys are sitting, it's that they're sitting in the middle of the game. And that is a coach's decision. Obviously, the front office of Toronto is telling the head coach, hey, these guys need to sit. We need to make sure that we lose these games. Scotty Barnes can't finish this game. We need to make sure that we lose to Portland. We're playing a little bit too well here. But at that point, once it becomes a coach's decision, how can the league truly regulate that? How can they even prove that anything happened here, that they violated any kind of rule? There's no rule in place that says that your best players have to finish the game. There's no rule in place that says that Scotty Barnes has to play a certain number of minutes if he starts the game. There's nothing in place for that, because what if your star, your third best player, whatever the case may be, isn't playing well and you want to sit them, or there's got kind of a nagging injury, you want to sit them, or there's 6 minutes left and you're down 40 and the guy doesn't come back in the game. There's really no way to regulate coaches' decisions, even ones that clearly, as egregiously as Toronto, tried to lose this game on purpose. And so at the end of the day, I would be surprised if they look into this, if there's some sort of punishment, but ultimately this is a problem for the league that will always exist. The incentive to tank, the incentive to lose games, to increase your lottery odds will always outweigh any of the negatives of potential fines, potential changing of your draft pick even. It would have to be such an extreme punishment that I don't see it happening ever, and it's going to continue to be a yearly thing. Even teams are going to find new ways to try and tank, new ways to lose games the way that Toronto did against Portland.